Hello and welcome to my first reading wrap-up of 2023. This is my January reading wrap-up. I read 11 books in January, which is for sure less than the last few months, but I read mostly physical books and I'm really happy with that amount. I feel like that is a good amount for me. It's not just stress reading the way I had been. So yes, I do have 10 books that I read off my shelves and then one audiobook that I got from the library, which I feel like is pretty good odds. Pretty much the only thing I missed out on were my ebooks and audiobooks that I read because of my job, so I kept up kind of the same level of reading. I do also want to say, caveat going into this video, this was like the month of mediocre reads for me. I had 1 2-star, 2 4-stars, and 8 3-stars. So everything was kind of like around the same, because even the 4 stars was like, I didn't really love either of them. Like, great books, not favorites. So kind of a mid-month. The first thing that I read in January was Out of the Dark by Natasha Cooper. This is a thriller about, oh, I've forgotten this completely. I was gonna describe this without looking at my notes, and then I was like, I have absolutely no idea what this was about. This is the 4th book in the Trish McGuire series, which is a British thriller series, apparently. This is the first one that I've read. I don't think reading them out of order is a hindrance in any way. But essentially, Trish McGuire is a lawyer, and an 8-year-old boy is hit by a car in front of her home, and the boy has her name stitched into his clothes. She has no idea who he is. So this book is essentially her search for who the boy is, why he was coming to find her, and it kind of takes her a lot of very interesting places, both away from home and in her own family. I gave this 2 stars. My review for this, my synopsis, also my review. My synopsis sucks because I just don't remember this at all. Like, this book left no impression on me. It was my 1 2-star. It's just so forgettable. I just remember being annoyed. Like, I was kind of down for the fun and drama at the beginning, but as it went along, I just cared less and less. I was so not invested. I didn't know who anyone was. Like, there were a lot of characters and none of them had any personality. She'd be like, oh, like, I went to the office and Robert did so-and-so and came up to me. And I'm like, who is Robert? Like, give me some context here, because I have no idea who he is. And it wasn't that Robert wasn't introduced. It was just that all the characters in this book were so unmemorable that, like, I just didn't remember. Like, there was Robert, there was George, there was, I assume, a Charles. It seems like the kind of book where there would be a Charles. Like, I literally couldn't tell the characters apart. Like, they would say someone came up to talk to her and I'm like, is that her boss? Is that her coworker? Is that a cop? Is that her husband? Like, I have no idea. And it also just in general kind of felt like it lacked focus. Like, there was so much going on in this. She was investigating this kid. There was some weird, like, financial crime case going on in the background that had no connection to anything else happening in this book. Like, it was so weird and disjointed and, like, lacked focus, and pretty much none of the elements had any development. And, like, I do think part of that is probably because it's a series, so, like, you kind of have to accept that, like, some things probably happened in earlier books and some things are going to happen in later books. But usually when I read series like this, they're pretty much self-contained. Like, everything that happens in them is kind of like given some sort of conclusion. And this book was just really all over the place. And then the overall story, the ending, was really, really obvious. Like, you were going along, like, trying to solve this case, but it was like, obviously, you knew what was going to happen from the beginning, because there are point of view characters in this who wouldn't make sense if they weren't directly related to the answer. Like, they would have no purpose being point of view characters in the story if they weren't, you know, the resolution to the case, which, like, can be done well. And I was kind of thinking there was going to be something else to the ending because it was so obvious, but you got to the ending and it was just like, oh, here's the reveal of, like, what happened, here's the answer, and then the book just ended. Like, there wasn't anything to the ending kind of apart from that, which was frustrating. And it was just, like, annoying and boring and very, very forgettable. Just, like, I had so few thoughts on this one. Then I read The Lying Game by Ruth Ware. This is another British thriller. This is my second Ruth Ware. I gave this 3 stars. This is a story of 4 school friends who all went to the same school and had something called the lying game, where they lied to people for fun, essentially. Like, there were technically points, but it was just a fun thing. And then something bad happened. They all got expelled from school and kind of lost touch, but now those bad things are coming back to haunt them, so they're all together again, trying to figure out how the past is like converging with their presence. Like I said, 3 stars. This was also just kind of mediocre. For me, it felt like this book was in the wrong genre. Like, I really liked the story and like the characters and what this could have been, but where it lacked was really the mystery thriller elements. Like, it was just kind of dull in that regard. Like, the strength of this story for me was the characters, and had this book had a lot more character development and really focused on the present day and who these people were and like how they became who they were, like their development from their teen years to their adult years, like this could have been really wonderful. But it spent so much time focusing on this mystery that I really didn't care about. I feel like nothing really happened at all in the first half of this book, which normally I really like slow books, but like slow books implied that you are building towards something. You're just building towards it slowly, whereas this felt like nothing was happening. For like the first 150 pages, it was just like introducing everyone. They were all hanging out. They were all freaking out over this very underwhelming thing. And like, yes, it does get worse later on in the book, obviously. But at the beginning, the thing they're worried about getting caught over, I'm not entirely certain it's even a crime. Like, it was just so underwhelming. They were talking about how it was going to ruin their lives and like their children were going to be taken from them. And I was like, I can't buy this at all. Like, if you went to the cops, like at worst, you probably would have gotten probation and they probably wouldn't have even charged with anything. Like, it was so weird. And then it would talk about things that happened and not introduce important characters until like decently into the book. Like, we're over 100 pages in and they're referencing this character who I don't even know. Like, I'm like, who is he? He hasn't been introduced yet. Like, I don't know his relation to this group or this story. And like, at that point in the book, I really kind of wanted to know. Like, we were at the point where I was like, I want a few more things explained. I need things to start happening a lot sooner than they did. And again, if she had focused a lot more on the characters and their development, I think that would have been fine. But because it was focused on the mystery aspect, it felt really flat for me. But it was fine. Like, once we got to the climax at the end, I did like the climax. Like, the climax was fun. It was exciting. I was down for the ride for like the final third. It was a little weird and over the top, but like, you know, that's mystery thrillers for you. But it was just getting there. It took so long, and I don't know if I have another Ruth Ware attempt in me, because I didn't really like this one, although I did like it better than In a Dark, Dark Woods, so I don't know. It's not one I'd recommend. It was just like, nothing happened in the first half, and the second half was like pretty fine. Then I finally finished 7 Games, A Human History by Oliver Roeder. This is a nonfiction book about game theory, and he basically covers 7 different games like checkers, chess, Go, backgammon, etc., and kind of like explains their histories, what they mean to the world, and how it relates to artificial intelligence, and like how people teach artificial intelligence to play games, and like how they program the artificial intelligence and what that means for society and learning, and like how that relates to what the game means to humans. If that explanation makes sense. It is a lot about game theory and artificial intelligence and computer programming, and like the history of the games is kind of a smaller aspect than I really expected it to be. It's a lot about artificial intelligence and teaching computers to play these games and how that's done. I gave this 3 stars. It's not a bad book. It's just, this dude, what does he have? Let me explain his credentials here. He studied artificial intelligence at Harvard University and has a PhD in economics focused on game theory. So, dude's a little above me. I was kind of operating at a disadvantage here. This book was a gift. It's really not my kind of thing. It's not really to my taste. I think it was really well done. I think if you're interested in game theory and artificial intelligence as it relates to like kind of basic games, I think you would find this really interesting. Like there was a lot in here that was worthwhile. It was just dry and kind of, you know, not for me. Like, well done, just this is one of those books that, like, I was not the audience here. I'm very obviously not the audience, but it was still a good book, and I would recommend it if you think you might be the audience. But it took me like 2 months to read, and it's only about 280 pages. Then I read Threads of Magic by Alison Croggon, which I have a full book review on, so I will link that down below. This is a middle grade fantasy novel about a young boy who is a pickpocket in a fantasy world, and essentially he pickpockets a dude who has a heart, like, that beats on its own, and the heart is magical, and Pip kind of just explores magic in the world and what the heart means for the world that they live in that is very cruel to people who practice magic, and the government is very corrupt, and it's a middle grade fantasy. He saves the day. Essentially, or like in some ways. I give this 3 stars. This was fine. Like, this was a really lovely, sweet book, but like it wasn't anything amazing. I mostly felt like it was underdeveloped. Like there were a lot of elements in here and a lot of elements that I really enjoyed, but I felt like they all just needed a little bit more development, a little bit more time, a little bit more explanation. Like everything was really cool. The magic system was really cool, but then it was kind of just like ignored a little. It gave you like a vague explanation and then kind of just went along with it after that, and I wish there had been a lot more. I really liked all the characters. I liked how they felt like children. Like that is one of the things I really like about middle grade, is that it lets kids be kids, and like they have a lot of responsibilities. Like they live in this fantasy world, and Pip is the 13-year-old who's basically an orphan taking care of his older sister. But he's still a child, and he still reads like a child and has like the immaturity of a child, like for all his responsibilities. And I really enjoy that. All the characters in this book were like that. I think they ranged from like 13 to 16, and I really enjoyed them, but I didn't quite connect with them emotionally the way I want. Like I want to really care about them, and I didn't. I think that came to like a little bit of the underdevelopment. And there were also like some tragic situations and some resolutions to those tragic situations that didn't quite feel earned. Like they felt like they came a little too easy. Like when something tragic and traumatic happens, even in a middle grade book, I want to feel something from that. I want it to be difficult for the characters to overcome. And it did kind of feel like they resolved a lot of their problems very, very easily. And it kind of made it feel like the problems in this world weren't really all that difficult or bad to begin with. This plane is getting lunch. But it was like a really nice book. It was a really nice middle grade fantasy. I think if you like middle grade fantasy, you'd probably enjoy this, but I don't think it was anything really spectacular. Girls Like Us by Cristina Alger. This is another adult thriller. I gave it 3 stars. I basically have nothing to say about this book. I don't even remember the synopsis. Like, even less than Out of the Dark, this was a void to me, which is kind of why I gave it 3 stars. But basically, this woman who's an FBI agent returns to her hometown after her father dies in a motorcycle accident. And she starts looking into a murder case that he was looking into, and then starts looking into a lot of corruption in the police department. He was a police officer, and it kind of starts to thinking her father might not be the good guy she thought he was, and also her mother had been murdered when she was a kid, and she starts thinking maybe her father had something to do with that and his police buddies covered it up, and that's essentially what this book is. It was so nothing. Like, I had no feelings on this. Like, it was fine. It was like the epitome of a fine thriller. I don't really have anything bad to say. I don't really have anything good to say. I did feel like the writing was stilted for like the first 70 or so pages, and then I kind of got used to it. And the other thing is just, it feels like a recent Law and Order SVU episode. Like, if you've watched any of their like kind of Me Too focused episodes in the last several years, it feels exactly like one of them. So if you really like those episodes, you would probably like this book. I'm kind of tired of those. Again, I've seen a lot of them. So I think this book was also a little bit worn out for me there, but it was just like nothing special, nothing really original. It was so short and so forgettable, and just, I basically have no thoughts. Then I read Dracula by Bram Stoker, which is for sure the highlight of the month. This is about a dude who goes to Transylvania to help a client. He's a lawyer, and he's helping him with like real estate stuff, and Dracula does some Dracula things. And then we go back to England, and it focuses on that dude's fiance and her friend who like has some mysterious sickness where she feels very ill and faint and appears to be suffering from blood loss for some very unknown reasons. And then Van Helsing and a doctor come in to like figure out what's going on, and things happen, and it's Dracula. Like, it's just Dracula. I gave this 4 stars. This was so much fun. Like, I had such a good time reading this. It's such a slow, interesting book. I love the epistolary format. Like, it makes it so cool. Like, it's so much more fun told in epistolary format than it would be through any other method, because it just makes it so much creepier and so much like kind of more personal with the characters. And the first section of this book was absolutely amazing. The first like 70 pages are Jonathan Harker's diary when he's in Transylvania. Best part of the book. Like, would have given that alone 5 stars. It was so good. And you're just like following this dude who's like, yeah, I'm here with a client. Like, yeah, things are a little weird, but like it's fine. And then as it goes on, he's like, oh, things are kind of sketch. This is very sketch. This is bad. This is very bad. I'm a prisoner. And like, it just keeps going on for 70 pages of him just being like, there are some very sketch vibes here. And then it stops. And it's like, the diary just stopping is like one of the most horrifying things I've read. Because it just like, there's no explanation. It just stops and you're like, oh no, what just happened? And then you kind of go back to England and follow everyone there, which I did enjoy that part of the book, but it never quite got to the same hype as the beginning for me. The beginning was amazing. And then the ending did drag a little for me, because I think I was so invested in Jonathan Harker and so invested in Lucy, who is his fiance's friend who is suffering the blood loss and mysterious illness. I was so invested in those stories. And then kind of once those stories are concluded a bit and you're really focusing on Dracula himself, I lost a little bit of interest. Like, it wasn't bad, but it was like towards the final third, it did start dragging for me, and it stopped being something that I really, really loved. But such a fun book, such a good read. Like, would highly recommend if you haven't read Dracula yet, because it was a good time. And Van Helsing is great. Like, okay, I will always picture Hugh Jackman as Van Helsing. It doesn't matter who he's supposed to be. I will always picture Hugh Jackman. But Van Helsing is such a troll. Like, he kind of gives me life. He's hilarious in this book and like kind of a terrible person, but I love him, so I would highly recommend Dracula. Then I read Methland, The Death and Life of an American Small Town by Nick Redding, which is a nonfiction book about Oldwine, Iowa, which is a small rural town in Iowa that had a very large meth problem in the early 2000s, and probably still today, but I don't really know. This book was focused on like, I think like 2005 to 2007, or around that range, and it's just focused on meth and meth addiction in the small town, and kind of what the town did about it, and how it affected everything going on in the town. And he followed like the mayor, an assistant prosecutor, a drug addict, a police officer, like a variety of people who were affected in the town by this. And this is just kind of the story of this one small town, and it is just specifically about Oldwine, but it's supposed to be kind of like indicative of what meth use looks like in a lot of these small rural towns. I give this 3 stars. I also have a full review of this book posted, so I will link that down below. This was fine. It was never quite what I wanted it to be. Like, it could have been like such an interesting book, like to turn the town into its own character and really write a beautiful portrait of the town. Like, that's what I was hoping this would be. And then it kind of fell flat. There's a lot of like weird random biographical information that seemed like unnecessary to the overall story. Like, a lot of this book is focused on the assistant prosecutor, Nathan Lane, and he gets into a lot of like very personal information about Nathan Lane that isn't really relevant to anything. Like, I would have really liked if this book had focused a little bit less on, like, his relationship with his parents and his Jewish ex-girlfriend, and kind of focused more on, you know, the meth addiction, which is what it was supposed to be about. And then there was also, like, a weird long section, not weird, but, like, kind of a lengthy section about, like, the history of meth and the meth trade from Mexico to the US, and kind of an overview of that. But it wasn't detailed enough to be really interesting. It was kind of just, like, a brief overview, and it felt kind of unnecessary. Like, had it been super detailed and in-depth, that would have been cool. But it was kind of just this vague overview, and it's like, I could have gotten that information from, like, Googling meth briefly and reading, like, a paragraph of the first results, you know? Like, it felt kind of unnecessary and a waste of space for this book. I did really like the journalistic writing, though, and, like, overall, it was, like, interesting and fine. Like, I gave it 3 stars. It was fine. The only other big problem, he apparently got a lot of facts wrong in the first edition, which he talked about in the afterword. In my edition, they were corrected, but I'm talking, like, basic facts, like the biggest city in Iowa. He got that wrong, and it's like, dude, like, how did that make it to publication? Like, that shouldn't have made it to publication, right? Like, I don't understand how he researched this book for years, spent so long writing it, and couldn't even bother to fact check, like, these small little things. Like, my journalism professors in college would have eviscerated me if I'd done that on any of my papers. So he did kind of lose credibility. Because it's like, if you can't check that stuff, how am I supposed to trust that you're checking everything else in this nonfiction book? So, a little bit disappointing. Not a bad book, I don't regret reading it, but, like, I was really hoping it'd be something, like, really wonderful and interesting, and it was just kind of, like, fine. And then my one audiobook that I started in December and took a long time to finish, Tomorrow Will Be Different, Love, Loss, and the Fight for Trans Equality by Sarah McBride. This is a memoir of Sarah McBride, who is a politician and a trans woman from Delaware. And it's essentially about her and her life and her transition and her young marriage. She was widowed at 24, which was very sad, and her getting into politics, and, like, I mean, she was a very political kid and then just kind of grew up and, like, got into politics, and now she's a state senator in Delaware, which happened after this book was published, I think. But this is just her memoir. I gave it 4 stars. Oh no, I had 3 4-star reads this month. That's better than I thought. This was really wonderful. I think political wise, it wasn't really anything special. Like, it definitely vibed like a political memoir. Like, she was trying to, like, keep the politics, like, vague and uplifting, and, like, not trying to alienate anyone. So, like, for that, it wasn't great, but the emotion in this was really wonderful. It was very sad. Like, her personal story of transition was, like, really touching and emotional, and kind of broke my heart when she came out to her parents and her parents reacted poorly. I'm glad they have a good relationship now, but it was really hard reading their initial reactions to that, and just, like, it was very emotional. And she talked a lot about her relationship in her early 20s and her marriage. She got married at 24 and her husband died a couple days after their wedding. And that was, like, really, really sad. I was listening to this while driving, and it was just, like, absolutely heartbreaking, like, made me cry a little bit. So I really think she did a great job with the emotion, and, like, I love a book that makes me feel something. It was very interesting. I wish she'd gone more in depth on politics. I think that would have been interesting. As someone who works in politics, she kind of pioneered a few bills for trans rights, and she worked for a lot of trans rights organizations, LGBT plus activists. I just kind of wish she'd gone into more details on, like, the specific advocacy and the work that she was doing, and, like, the politics that she was, like, actively involved in, and kind of, like, not really a step-by-step guide, but, like, kind of explain the process a little more. I felt like that would have added something interesting to the book, but, like, it was still a 4-star, like, worthwhile read. I would definitely recommend it. It was pretty great. Then I read A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick, which is a science fiction classic, perhaps. I don't know if it's old enough to be a classic, but close enough. This was recommended to me by my boyfriend for my 12 books of 2023 project. This was the first one I got to, and I gave it 3 stars. This basically focuses on a future world in which a drug called Substance D has taken over the world, America, and Fred is a cop who is investigating Substance D users and dealers, and just kind of like he's investigating. And he's an undercover cop, and his undercover identity is Bob Arctor. And he is given the assignment to investigate Bob Arctor specifically, even though it's him. And then he starts taking more Substance D, getting more addicted to Substance D, and his mind starts kind of breaking down the middle, and he starts seeing these two identities as separate people and like doesn't know that they're both him. So the book is basically that. I didn't love this. I think what's really interesting about it is the writing style and the narrative. And it's a book about a bunch of drug addicts. Like, it's about him and like the people he lives with and his friends, his undercover identities friends. So basically, everyone who narrates this book is a drug addict who is using a lot of Substance D. And because of that, the narrative feels like really disjointed. It lacks cohesion. It doesn't flow naturally. But that makes it really like wonderful. Like, it really gives the vibe that this story is being told by drug addicts. And it took me a really long time to get into because of that. Like, I did not enjoy the first half, but I really liked the second half. And like, I would recommend it for that. Like, it was fascinating. It was a great way to tell a story. And I really liked watching the main character, Fred/Bob, kind of lose himself, because it happens slowly throughout the book. There's not a line where he just like stops being Fred and Bob and starts being Fred and Bob as two separate entities. Like, it happens slowly. There's no lines. Like, him turning into Fred versus Bob, like, it's just really interestingly done, and it like kind of all flows together, and it just feels really jumbled and like good. Like, I really liked the way he did it. It was interesting. One odd thing about this, which I think kind of left a sour taste in my mouth and might have lowered my rating, I don't know. Like, I read it kind of like right after I read the book, so it's kind of all like woven together. I'm not sure if I would have given it 4 stars without this, but his author's note at the end was kind of weird, and he was talking about this book, how it was about drug addicts and how drug addiction is a choice that is made, and like on and on, all about like how this book is about addiction. And like, I was reading that thinking, I must have read a different book than the one he published, because to me this book wasn't really about addiction or about drug addicts. It was about the system. It was about the police force. It was about the pharmaceutical industry. Like, it was about all the systems in place around drug addiction, and the drug addicts were just kind of the vehicle to tell the story. Like, they didn't feel important to me, if that makes sense. Like, I mean, not that they weren't important to the story, they were the narrators, but like, that wasn't what mattered here, at least in my takeaway of reading it. So like, reading his author's note did kind of ruin that a little. I kind of wish I hadn't read it. It gave weird vibes. Like, I don't know if I'm alone, but his takeaway in the author's note was not my takeaway from reading this. So, weird vibes. Then I read Cracked Up to Be by Courtney Summers, which is a YA contemporary about a girl who used to be head cheerleader, dated the captain of whatever popular sport was at their high school, very popular, and then something happens and she kind of self-destructs. She gets caught drinking at school, she gets into a lot of trouble, she implodes her life, pushes all her friends away, pushes her boyfriend away, and this is where the story picks up, when like everyone is kind of watching her for bad behaviors, and she's on like a lot of restrictions, and she's going to the guidance counselor every week, and they're threatening to expel her and not let her graduate. I gave this 4 stars. I like Courtney Summers a lot. Her writing style is gorgeous. I love the way she tells stories. This is her debut novel, so I feel like she does a lot of things well in this. I connected so much with the characters. I loved kind of the overall story. I loved what it meant. I loved the relationships that happened. They were so developed and so interesting, and I connected so much with this. But like, it did have its flaws as a debut. Like, there were definitely melodramatic moments. Like, she kept just passing out at school randomly. Like, she has panic attacks, she has anxiety, and I don't really have a problem with her passing out at school. It was more the way that it was done. It was really like weird and melodramatic and kind of just like done to add easy drama, and it wasn't well developed, and it was just like, it felt like an add-on. It felt very fake. It didn't feel right in the story, and there were like a few things like that that just didn't work. Like the melodrama in this didn't work, but there was so much that did. Like in another book, all the little moments that made it feel over the top, that kind of felt like a put on, that didn't feel real, would have ruined this for me, because I feel like those elements could easily ruin a book. But what Courtney Summers does well, she does so well. And like, I love this so much. I love the relationship between the main character and her jock ex-boyfriend. Like, it would have been so easy to fall into the trope of just like, oh, he's just a dumb jock and like he doesn't really care about anything, he's just a popular boy. But he was so well developed, their relationship was so well developed, and had so much nuance, and like you could tell they had a really great friendship, and like their relationship wasn't like based on just like, oh, they were both the popular kids. They had a lot in common, and like it was actually so great. Like, it was my favorite part of this book. And she does so many things that are like negative things. Like, she treats people really badly, and it's so interesting and well done, and you kind of find yourself on her side and relating to her in some ways, even when she's doing these bad things. She just feels like a kid, like a messed up kid, and I loved it. It was flawed. I wouldn't deny that, but what Courtney Summers does well, she does so well. I'm really glad to be reading her backlog, because she is one of my favorite authors. And then the final book that I read in January was Driven by Dane Cobain. This is a mystery book, the first in the Lightfold files, the Lightfold mysteries. I gave this 3 stars. It's basically about a private detective who has a failing business, and he's trying to jumpstart his private detective agency, and he hires an assistant who's kind of a computer whiz kid, and he investigates a hit and run of a young actress and decides that the police think it's an accident, but he knows it was murder. So he investigates that and then works very closely with a police officer. I wanted to like this, but it was one of those books that just, it kind of fell flat for me. Like, it was fine. Like, there wasn't much that was like wrong with it. It was fine. It was an interesting story. I just didn't love it, and I really wanted to. I think the hardest thing for me was that I didn't connect with the writing style. It always felt kind of stilted. It didn't flow very well. Like, all of the scenes were very short, like usually less than 2 pages, and it felt like it jumped around a lot, and it never really connected with me. Like, I could never just like fall into the story and just like read with ease. I'd like read 3 pages and then find myself just like checking my phone or putting the book down or just like looking at the clock to see how long I've been reading, and I just never got into it. And the dialogue itself always felt kind of off. Like, it never felt very realistic. It kind of always felt like the characters were over explaining themselves in a way that didn't really work. Like, it didn't sound like how people talk naturally, which I didn't get along with. And there was a lot of physical descriptions of characters that I didn't love. Like, a lot. Like, every time a new character was introduced, and sometimes even when a character you already knew was introduced to a new point of view character, like the narrative would pause and there'd just be like a paragraph description of their physical appearance, which was kind of weird and jarring. Like, I never got used to it. It never felt natural. I get that physical descriptions are important. I just feel like maybe there was a better way to do it. And it happened throughout the book. Like, even at the end, like on page 200 of this like 215 page book, a new character was introduced who existed only on that page. You know, there are 15 pages left, and then there's like a whole paragraph about who she is and what she looks like, and like right down to the allergy bracelet on her wrist. And I was like, why does this matter? Like, we're at the climax of this book. Like, why am I meeting someone new and hearing all about them? Like, I assume that she's probably in a later book and that's why, but it felt kind of jarring to me. But the story was fun. Like, I liked the story. I was down for the ride. Like, there wasn't anything that was like wrong with it. I just didn't really connect to it, and I don't know, it was fine. Like, I feel bad because I really want to like love and support Dane's books, but like, I don't know, like, I don't have really much to say on it. Like, it was an entertaining ride, but I don't know, it's one of those mysteries that I'm probably just never gonna think about again, unfortunately. But it wasn't bad, so there's that. I will also add, this reminded me a lot of Agatha Christie, and I realized last year, upon reading her for the first time, that I don't really like Agatha Christie. So maybe it's just this type of vibe that I don't like. And if you like Agatha Christie, you will probably like this a lot more than I did. So that was everything that I read in January. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them if you have. And as always, thank you so much, and I will see y'all again soon.